everybody, my name is Jessica Sachs, and today I'm going to introduce the Cypress component testing library for Vue. So a little bit about myself. I'm a software engineer and tech lead at Cypress.io. I'm on the component testing squad. I've been programming for about 10 years now. 3 of those I was a QA, so I have a lot of feelings about testing. I'm a maintainer of Vue's test utils, as well as a contributor of Vue Style Guidist. Personally, I watch a lot of baseball, and I used to travel a lot, but now I play a lot of music at home and watch a lot of anime. So let's get into it. So at Cypress, our goal is to build open source software that enables teams to have confidence in their code. And so you have to ask, what kind of code is in a modern front-end code base? What kind of code needs confidence? And nowadays, it's a lot of components, which hopefully means there's a lot of component tests. So some statements I'm going to make. Components are built for the browser. And the second is that the closer your tests resemble your end user's interactions, the more confidence they can bring you. So users don't use your components in the terminal in jest. They don't interact with your components as if they were just snapshots. They open browsers and they experience the styles that you've written, and they experience the DOM markup and the network requests fired and the timing issues. They experience all of it. And there's a few problems with experiencing all of it, right? End-to-end tests generally do this, and they're notoriously flaky because they don't mock enough. There's no stability. But you want to get as close as possible without sacrificing test stability. You want to get as much bang for your buck as possible, I think. You want to write tests that test something, not that test your mocks. So what's really cool about Cypress is that Cypress does a stellar job at testing in real browser environments. And that's a huge challenge. In the past, we had tools like Phantom.js. They really struggled to render and build reliably on CI systems. But now we have things like Electron and Headless Chrome, and they're fairly stable. Especially now with Docker, building native browsers isn't as challenging as it used to be in CI. So our tooling has come a lot further than the last time front-end tried to do browser-based testing. So because Cypress has such a stable environment and powerful set of mocking, DOM querying, and user-friendly debug tools, I think that building a component testing library on top of it can change the game for component testing. So that's what we'll be talking about today. So what is the Cypress component testing library? Some gaps in today's component testing approaches, a demo that I wrote for a crossword game, and then a little bit about what's next for the project. So let's start with, what is the Cypress component testing library? And in short, it's a collection of framework-specific rendering utilities. Essentially, it's a mount function, and all of the setup and teardown associated with that mount function to clean up after the environment. So if you've used Vue test utils, it is the mount function with the same signature and some added options for global styles. And you pass in your component as the first argument, and it renders it. It's a little bit more than doing new Vue in 2.6. The Cypress component testing library also builds your components for you. So in Vue test utils right now, you have to use a test runner like Jest, and that depends on you redeclaring a lot of your Webpack configuration or Vue CLI configuration within Jest again. And Cypress uses Webpack to build your components, so it can piggyback off of the existing Vue CLI rules. But most of the magic isn't in the Cypress component testing library. Most of the magic is actually within all the features that the Cypress ecosystem has. But what we've built should feel familiar. You know, we're a thin wrapper around Vue test utils, and we do expose the VTU wrapper to you, so you should feel comfortable writing component tests the way you're used to. You can use set props, you can use find and find component. One of the other things that Cypress does really well is it has many multi-browsers supported. So you can use Chrome or Firefox or any Chromium-based browser like Edge to test your components. And it also supports a headless mode with Electron so that you can do the same thing in CI. And like I mentioned before, running real browsers in CI was one of the biggest headaches of previous attempts at doing real component testing in the browser. Other powerful features that Cypress has is network stubbing. That's one of the biggest headaches for new users to Vue test utils. Our mocking support, our network mocking support, is framework agnostic and package agnostic. We support plain files, just JavaScript objects, Mirage.js, as well as a express style resolver function, which can be as complex as you would like. Oftentimes, if you're writing in Vue test utils, you might have to do something like the above, where you mock Axios explicitly and then define for each route and each object type what you would like to happen, and that can be really tedious. And so oftentimes you'll end up mocking a little further up the chain. You'll end up mocking your API wrappers kind of at the store level or near the store level, because mocking Axios is a little too low level in Node. And it's a little frustrating because if it wasn't so cumbersome, it would give you a lot more coverage to test all of your store logic and your API request logic while you're testing your components. So Cypress has a great foundation to work on top of, and getting components rendering in Cypress with Vue test utils as the foundation has actually been really easy. And so Cypress put together a strong team with expertise in component testing. We have a bunch of people from Vue, and then we also have a core developer from Material UI for React. So it's a great group of people, and I'm really excited to work with them. So that's cool, and it's clear that Cypress has interest in component testing, but isn't Cypress an E2E framework? Aren't we supposed to be focused on end-to-end testing? And the answer is yes and no. We were built with end-to-end testing in mind. I think right before component testing became as important as it is today. And right now, component tests are integral to front-end work. You know, I think front-end engineers learn how to write component tests at the same time that they learn how to write unit tests. Like, you almost write components before you write functions. That's not true, but oftentimes it feels that way. It's like you start with a new Vue file, not a new JavaScript library file. At least I find that I do. But Cypress is just a powerful test runner made for querying and interacting with elements in the browser. There's nothing end-to-end specific about it. It just has a lot of powerful underlying tools that had to be added for end-to-end testing, but are now just really convenient batteries included features for component testing, like network stubbing or a very powerful debugging interface. So I think that Cypress component testing library is uniquely positioned to solve key problems in component testing today. And I'd like to talk about the gaps that exist right now in our modern component testing approach. And so I'm assuming that people are using a Jest-based or Mocha-based setup with JS DOM and Vue test utils if you're using Vue. And we were at a Vue conference, so I'm pretending you're using Vue. So debugging in JS DOM is extremely painful. The output that you get when you try to log DOM elements in JS DOM is just terrible. It's like the object type, and then you end up, or I end up, writing like .inner HTML to understand what actually happened in that DOM object. In component testing, the Vue test utils wrapper makes that a little bit better because you get HTML as a function. But still, you're staring at a string of markup in your terminal and trying to understand between all the rendered classes and commented out blocks, like, where's the issue? And usually when we're debugging, we're in Chrome. We're in Chrome and we're interacting with our components, which you cannot do in Jest. So you end up putting breakpoints here and there, whereas if you were in the browser, you might just be able to click on it and see the console error really quickly, step to that line. It's just a very different flow. You also have in Chrome Debugger, you have element event breakpoints, so you can breakpoint on different mouse events, etc., as you interact with the component. So all of that is lost when you move to Jest. You also don't get access to your framework-specific dev tools, or any dev tools really. If you do, you get access to the re-implementations of existing tools. For example, in Jest, the DOM elements don't have an element explorer. And to bridge that, some very nice person has written a third-party element explorer that you can use when you attach Jest to your Chrome debugger, if you like the remote debugger protocol. At that point, if you try to console log out your JS DOM HTML element, instead of giving you the terrible output it used to, it gives you a real element explorer. But this person had to implement an entire library to give you what you already have in the browser. It's clear people want to debug the way that they're used to debugging, not in a crippled way. And more issues I have are the styles aren't loaded and the images aren't loaded, which means that if you're doing things like binding functions to onload handlers, stuff like that, you need to make sure that your file mock that Jest requires you to write, because it's not going to import real images for you, that your file mock is actually responding with the correct events. And so you sometimes wind up with very complex file mocks to match the behavior you're expecting to receive in your source code. Whereas if you had just tested in the browser, you would be able to actually load the image. Maybe off of a fake request. Maybe you don't want to actually query the internet for your image. Maybe you want to spoof the request. But at least you would be loading the DOM image and firing the onload handler, like the real onload handler. So right now that's not a thing that JS DOM does for you. So finally, my biggest beef with modern component testing approaches is that the document isn't polyfilled, the document requires polyfills. So you need things like request animation frame you need things like fetch, just fetch. You cannot do in a basic jest setup. You have to go in and usually mock Axios for your network requests. And it's pretty unfortunate that you have to do so many steps to test a basic app. And at the end of the day, even when you set up all of these testing mocks, your application has become further removed from the production-like user experience. So you don't have as much confidence over your code if you're mocking out so much. So I think that working with the Cypress component testing library lets you actually see your components, and I hope to demonstrate all of these things in the demo coming up. Actually see your components with real styles and interact with them and debug them with Vue's dev tools. This is my biggest plus one, is like you get to actually play with your components in the browser with the dev tools that you love and you use. And without context switching. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this point, because what I mean by context switching is that, for me at least, when I do development for components right now, I either open an app, serve my app on port 8080 and then go there, or I open up a isolated development environment like Style Guidist or Storybook. So I either open the app or I open a style guide, basically, and I develop my components in one of those two places because they're very visual. Because as I'm playing with the component, I'm also styling it. And that's not strict TDD. It's pretty bad as far as the TDD philosophers would say. And I wish that those workflows weren't disjointed, but it's just not possible for me to test what I want to test or have a stable component before I write my styles. I need to do both at the same time. And I wish that, honestly, I just wish that my style guide in this example was testable. I wish that my stories in Storybook, I could just point an expectations framework at that, and that would give me what I want. And that's what I think that Cypress does, is that I no longer have to have a style guide open or my app open to develop. I get to do all of my styling inside of Cypress, inside of a it should mount kind of assertion, right? So at least I generally, when I start with a component, the first thing I do is just try to make it mount and make sure it exists. It's like the smoke test you write, If everything's broken, at least that one will break first. So when I do that now in Cypress, and you'll see this in the demo, is I just get the opportunity to play with my component and style it. And then right afterwards, I copy and paste my it should mount block, and then I start interacting with it like the user would. And so it's pretty cool. I'm excited to show you. So you also, because we're in a real browser, because Cypress runs on Chromium-based browsers and Firefox, you don't have to polyfill anything, including any Vue components that are built in. So there's no polyfilling of router link or transition. And transition in Vue test utils has always been a fraught subject because it requires a lot of asynchronous handling, and that's something Cypress does really well. So last thing is that Cypress will bundle your code. Cypress will bundle your code with Webpack, and there are no jest-only module bundlers needed. So what's the difference? What's the difference between the two? And it is browser-based component testing. It is not that we are testing better. We are removing some ambiguity. We are, filling in some gaps in coverage that mocking gives you for Node. So you're mocking less, gives you more coverage, but essentially it's just shifting the workflow into the browser. It's removing that context switch between writing your components in Node and then also writing them in the browser. You just do them once in the browser and you get a nice sandbox. It's kind of like a JS fiddle, except testable. Okay, so enough talk. It's time for the demo. I'm excited to show it to you. Okay, so this is the component testing with Crosswords app. It uses an external endpoint to fetch some crossword data, which has some position information for how to render it, as well as some clues and answers to play the game with. And so when you click on one of the clues, it takes you to a related cell that you can answer in. So this answer is again, or I think it is, and so I can use my little magic solve button to check. It's backed by a router and a Vuex store. You see that it also asked for the user to confirm via an alert if they wanted to dismiss it. What we're going to do is we're going to implement a loading skeleton between route changes. So when you hit previous and next, we're going to add a skeleton loader. Before we do that, I'm going to show you what this app looks like when it's tested with the Cypress component testing library. So it does everything from re-renders the crossword to fetching external network requests. You can stub out the network requests if you want. And then after you're done, you can play with the end state of the application. So it really is just like a style guide in that you can play with all of your examples. And play with the knobs and stuff. It feels very, very interactive. So that's enough. That's enough of that. Let's go into the code. So we're inside of the crossword spec, and the first thing we're going to do is add a transition. And for anybody who has worked with Vue test utils, this is the worst. Dealing with transitions in component testing in Node is very hard. And so we've just dropped a transition in there. The first thing is that it didn't fail, which is great. If you do this in Node, it just fails. So now we'll look at the test code. And so we have a stub for transitions as false. And that's kind of the inverse of what usually happens with Node. You can see that actually in the Cypress app. If we slow down for a second, we're using the pause functionality. And so pause allows you to take a second and look at the UI and make sure that you see the interaction you're looking for. So in this case, we wanted to pause before the loading finished. So then we set data loading to false, and we can visually see the other component come in. So that is the transition demo. It's very quick, and so the point of the rest of this is we're going to implement the skeleton, which is a lot more fun, but a lot more CSS. So the workflow I follow is I write one passing spec. I write I expect this div to exist in the DOM kind of a spec. You can see that it is there, but not visualized because there's the little eyes that are closed in the debug menu. And the rest of this is going to be me speed coding using the magic of video recording. So essentially we're going to render, a two-dimensional array of cells, which represents the crossword grid. And then we're going to style the cells that are supposed to be colored. We're going to color them in with the CSS class conditionally. And so I imported a style sheet on line 21, which should make all this really, really easy and clean. And so now we'll see that it is not black and white. It is all white. And this is where the power of Cypress's visual debugging is lovely. You can just inspect your elements and you can see that we still apply the classes correctly, but unfortunately nothing's happening. And we can pull up the CSS inspector and say, like, what's going on here? There's nothing here. I don't see the class at all. There's nothing it's not even imported, right? And so we'll look and we'll say, okay, but it's the same word, and I guess that if I find it in my editor, there's something for blocked dash out, and oh, that was the class that I meant to put in. And when we fix that class error, everything looks correct, and we have pretty high confidence that we fixed the bug. And that's the kind of workflow that you get when you're working with Cypress component testing libraries. You get this tight-knit, on one side of your screen you can see the component render, and on the other side you have your spec. And you can go ahead and now write assertions about this. So that was a very quick demo, but now let's get back to the theory. So putting browser-based component testing into your testing strategy looks a little bit like just shifting integration over to the right and making a divide in the sand where your environment dictates what is most natural to write in. So if you're writing stuff that touches the DOM, you make a component test in the browser. And if you're writing stuff that touches a file system, you put it in an integration test in Node. And there is a blurred line, right? It's like, if you're writing a library that might touch the browser, or it might be server-side rendered, you have a choice, and you could put it in the browser. It's an experiment, right? We're not sure exactly what that strategy looks like. I do know that component testing should be in the browser. It is just so much simpler. Also, kind of an open question is what happens if unit testing goes in the browser? Is that weird? Maybe weird for performance reasons, but aside from that, just philosophically, is that a good idea? So, wrapping up, what's next for the Cypress component testing library? And we're working on bundling speed and complex bundling setups. Because there's no just config file for us, we are taking the brunt of Webpack's complexity and making sure that everything will render properly. Bundling user source code is a new thing for Cypress. It has never been its specialty. It was an E2E tool, so getting good at bundling user source code is kind of a new thing for the framework. We're working on an installation wizard, so helping you scaffold your new projects. We already have a Vue CLI plugin, but trying to make that more thought through so you can have both end-to-end tests and component tests living side by side. We also need better routing support. I think that's one of the biggest blockers right now. I was able to make it work in my demo, but it was not pretty. And then finally, documentations and guides need to be fleshed out before we're ready to move out of alpha. So we're currently in alpha, and you can play with it today using GCLI and Vue add Cypress experimental. The ideas that we're talking about aren't unique to Cypress, and you can point any existing E2E testing solution at a working storybook or style guide to experience this kind of close-knit TDD style guide mesh. So go forth and write your component tests where they belong in the browser next to the tools you love to use. Thank you so much.